Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 59, Unforeseen Consequences. It had been a good morning for Weiss. She'd woken from a pleasant dream that may have involved a certain blonde cooking for her, which was something she sorely missed despite her personal world-class chefs. Jacques was still being hounded by the press and the police, and she was finally going to reach out to Yang again. She'd been hesitant over the last few days due to Jacques being more suspicious of her actions, and wouldn't put it past him to track her a little. But his attention had finally been diverted by continuous shareholder meetings and fixing the mess that had been made. So as she stepped out of the shower and began getting ready for her day, she hummed happily to herself. It didn't take long, roughly 30 minutes, until she left her room and made her way down the corridor to the dining hall for breakfast. On her way, she passed the new cleaning staff, but she wasn't too fond of them yet. Though staff usually came and went, it had been some time since there had been a mass firing, and they had clearly heard about it. So instead of the friendly smiles and good mornings that the old staff gave, the new one simply tried to be as invisible as possible. Nevertheless, Weiss gave them a friendly smile anyway. It helped that Klein had informed her that a few of the laid-off workers had already found new jobs due to her recommendation. She could smell breakfast before she arrived at the dining room. It smelled like grease and freedom. It was very rare that unhealthy food was served in the Schnee household, but it was always the same person who requested it to be made. Though Whitley also liked to stay healthy, maybe a little too much as the boy was rather skinny, he did appear to like his junk food. He only ever ordered it when his father was away, but over the last week as she spent more time with him, she had seen candy wrappers in his bin, as well as a small bag that looked to be from a cheap burger joint. So as she walked into the room, it didn't surprise her much to see him slowly eating his way through a fried sausage and egg muffin. What she hadn't expected, though, was for both of their faces to fall as she entered the room. Her brother paused mid-bite, and his eyes lingered on her for a moment before he slowly returned to his food. Her mother, however, who had been happily watching her son out the corner of her eye, seemed to pull something off of the table as her brow furrowed in worry. Just before it was completely hidden from view, Weiss glimpsed the edge of a newspaper. Though her suspicions were raised, she sat down at the table and hoped they would explain. "Morning," she said with a small smile as her mother's eyes gazed into hers. "I take it that it's just us this morning?" "Yes," Willow replied with a weak smile. "Your father got called away on business. Anything I should know about? You know I'm not privy to the ongoing at TH. I don't see why you are hiding it from her, Mother," Whitley interrupted in a bored voice, clearly more interested in his muffin than the conversation, but joining in anyway. "It's hardly like she won't hear about it at some point." Weiss' curiosity was definitely piqued at the boy's words, and she looked directly at her mother. "What is he talking about?" she asked firmly. Her mother seemed contemplative for a second, the thoughts rushing past her eyes, but Weiss narrowed her gaze to show she was serious, and the woman let out a small sigh of resignation. "I wanted you to at least eat your breakfast before you saw it," she breathed and pulled the paper back up from her side. "But your brother is right. It would hardly be right of me to not let you prepare yourself." "Prepare myself for what?" she asked as her mother purposely placed the newspaper on the table so that the header was hidden. The moment her mother's hand moved aside, she reached out and pulled the paper towards herself and slowly turned it over. "Please remember this isn't your FAU." Weiss tuned her out as her stomach dropped. The title alone was enough to make her want to throw up. 9 Dead in White Fang Attack on Mantle Mine. Below the title, before the story itself, was a picture of words painted on the front of a Schnee mine. The words, and their meaning, were clear as day. 9 of ours. 9 of yours. As Weiss read through the front page article, she slowly felt her face pale, and her good mood fade away. The White Fang had stormed a mine towards the end of a shift and captured the management staff. Military had responded fast, but by the time they got there, the people were already dead and the terrorists had escaped into the tundra. There were paragraphs and pages dedicated to the victims and the families they left behind, and by the time she finished reading them, her stomach was churning and full. The deaths were her fault. She had leaked the information. She hadn't bothered to think what would happen outside of how it would affect her father, hadn't bothered to think of how it would affect the already volatile state that Atlas was in. Weiss! How had she been so narrow-minded? So blind? so focused on one goal that she had failed to even give a thought to how it would affect everyone but those close to her. How had she failed to remember that the world was bigger than her? Bigger than the company? That things were more complex? Schneeflock, it's not. She was already on her feet, the sudden action doing nothing to help how queasy she already was, and began to make for the door. It was barely a minute before she was in the nearest bathroom, her head over the toilet, and tears streaming down her face as her body tried to throw up food that wasn't in her stomach. How? She cried inwardly. How could I put others through that? Through what I went through? Whitley watched as his sister rushed past him and out of the room, likely to end up in the bathroom of the bar next to the music room, since it was the closest. He'd expected as much, but that didn't stop him from feeling something for his sister. It had shocked him that she'd been true to her word, but ever since he'd been taken to that girl's house, his sister had definitely been making an effort to get to know him better. It had been small at first, simply checking on him and defending him occasionally, but it had recently turned into her choosing to work in his room. And in truth, he didn't totally hate it. Sure, she asked a lot of questions and constantly tried to pry into his business, but he did appreciate the fact that she was trying. He'd never hated his sister after all. He just simply hadn't expected anything from her after he woke to find Winter just gone one day after her ignoring him too. But it was kinda nice to see that was no longer the case. You should have let her eat first, Willow said as he took a bite of his muffin. He didn't bother to look at her. Why would he? Why? He sighed in annoyance once he was done with his mouth full. He hated being rushed with things he enjoyed, especially when they were so rare. It would have been regurgitated regardless. This way there is less for her to lose. That is not the point, Whitley, the woman said. He saw her brow furrow into a scowl out the corner of his eyes. It's about letting her be happy for a little longer. I fail to see how letting her live in ignorance to the consequences of her actions is better, he retorted and stood up to head out of the room. He would rather not be stuck with his maddening mother any longer than he had to be. She started this war with father, so she should be ready to face the realities that it is about more than just her. As he picked up 2 slices of unbuttered toast, he walked towards the door, only to hear his mother speak again in a low voice. I don't like this attitude, Mainson. His blood boiled at her words, but he kept himself composed and turned to face her. I couldn't care less what you like, he spat as he glared at her. And I would prefer you not call me that. Hardly seems fitting considering the fact you were never actually around. Hurt and shame filled the woman's eyes, but he didn't care. Why should he? His words were true after all. So what if she had stopped drinking? So what if she was watching him more closely while thinking he didn't notice? So what if she seemed sorry? Sorry didn't fix things. Sorry didn't change what she was. The house drunk, nothing more. She would eventually realize that and slip back into her role again. Forgiving her would be nothing more than a waste of his time. So with little more than a sneer at the woman, he walked towards the door to check on his sister. At least she cared. Weiss wished she could go back to when she had woken up, to when the day ahead of her had seemed bright and happy, but she knew she couldn't. Gone was the desire to call Yang and idly chat. Gone was her desire to read the news and revel in Jacques' misery. There was no time machine for her to use, no way to take back what she had found out, what she had caused. And despite her mother's words of it not being her fault, and her brother's reassurance as he sat outside the bathroom that the white fan had always been looking for an excuse, she knew it was her that caused it. Without her leaking the document, the mine likely wouldn't have been attacked. The people would still be alive, Atlas wouldn't be on lockdown, a war wouldn't have started. A war her sister was likely going to have to fight. Her once sweet victory had turned bitter, and the taste of bile clung to Weiss' throat for the whole day. College had been torturous. The judgmental stares of her classmates followed her wherever she went, and the lecture seemed to drag on forever. She'd barely taken in a single word her professor said, the words little more than noise as she skimmed through articles that were coming out of Atlas. She'd learned a little of what had happened, how they had infiltrated the workers and waited to strike. One of the Faunus workers said in an interview that one of them had pretended to be assaulted, and with the already high tensions from the news, instigated a rebellion against the human workers. After that, everything had apparently been a blur, and none of the other reports painted a clear picture. When she'd had enough of the reports, and her classes had ended, she'd left the campus to where Hazel was waiting for her. She wanted nothing more than to tell him to take her to the apartment, to yawn so that she could cry and be comforted by the woman she loved, but she knew she couldn't. She had work, a lot of work, and to call in sick would raise suspicion from the elder Schnee when he had only just turned his full attention back to work. She didn't want that. So that was where he had taken her, and where she'd been for the last 3 hours, diligently doing her work in her cubicle, while her coworkers snuck glances at her. It was actually kind of infuriating, but she really didn't have the energy to say anything. Besides, they were staring due to something she had done, and what was a little discomfort compared to that. "Have you got those numbers, Schnee?" the head of the department said, as he strolled over and looked at her expectantly. "Which ones?" she asked dully, not bothering to look away from her computer. "The ones for the Argent project." Without bothering to reply, she glanced to her side and flicked through the stack of files she had already finished. She quickly found the one with a gray tab and pulled it free. "Good work," he said tiredly. He wasn't the most pleasant guy ever, but he rarely gave her many issues. He liked to focus on his own work. "There is a girl here to talk to you, by the way." "What?" Weiss perked up at that, and looked to where the man was pointing as a girl heading in her direction. For the first time since meeting her, she'd been disappointed to see Seal. "Oh." Stupid Weiss, she thought to herself. Jan wouldn't have shown up at her work. "Good afternoon, Miss Schnee," the girl said with a pleasant smile. She looked just as smart as usual with her white shirt and blue skirt, and just like it had been ever since she saw her, the watch Weiss had given her for Christmas adorned her wrist. "Hello, Seal," she said, unable to summon much cheer to her own voice. "How can I help you?" "I've actually been sent by Mr. Caspin. He would like a word with you." "Really?" Weiss asked in shock, not sure what Edward could want with her, but earning a nod anyway. "Okay, let me just finish this up." "Of course," Seal said with a smile. It only took 5 minutes for her to finish her work, and since it was near the end of her shift anyway, she picked up her bag as she stood and indicated for the Elysian girl to lead the way. Edward no longer really worked in the company building, but usually returned from working at home when he felt it was needed. Due to the inconsistency of it though, Weiss had no idea what office he had taken up this time, since it tended to be different each time. "So," Weiss said as they walked down the corridor, "how have you been?" "Not too bad. Quite busy recently, but that's to be expected with everything that has happened." "I guess," Weiss sighed dully. She saw Seal glance at her, clearly noticing the dejected tone, before taking a quick look around the corridor. With everyone busy at work, they were very much alone, and the woman took a deep breath. "Weiss, could I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied tiredly. "Well," she asked cautiously, "I haven't forgotten that last month you asked me to look into one of those mines the news reported. And with what has come out lately, I can't help but wonder if I have played a part in something I wasn't aware of." Weiss looked up at the woman, and yet again felt some shame in her actions. Seal had been the one to uncover the information that led Weiss to where she was now, so it was undeniable that her former assistant had definitely played a part. And she could hardly lie, since she considered her a friend, and a friend had the right to know. "I'm sorry I got you involved in this mess, Seal," she sighed, and raised a hand to rub her tired eyes. How much more could go wrong in one day? "That wasn't right of me." Seal slowly came to a stop, and Weiss stopped beside her, too ashamed to look into those blue eyes. "I'm not angry, Weiss," she said softly. "Nor do I regret helping you, and will gladly help in the future should you need it, but I would like to know in advance what I am getting myself involved in." That had not been what she expected, and she looked up into her friend's blue eyes. However, there was some sadness there. "Especially after what has come to light today." Shame rushed through her again. Seal helping meant that she also contributed to the situation that had haunted her all day, and the sadness in the navy-haired woman's eyes clearly showed she felt the same way about the situation. Weiss let out a small sigh and shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but you have done more than enough. I would rather you not get mixed up in this any further." "If that is what you wish," Seal said, and began to walk towards the elevator. "But my offer stands. Despite everything that has happened, I do still think you were right to do what you did." "Thank you, Seal," she whispered as she walked into the elevator beside her. If she was honest with herself, she didn't know if she could agree anymore. The rest of the journey was spent in silence. It hardly felt right to Weiss to engage in small talk given how the day had been, and she didn't have the energy to pry about that, not when she had already been struggling to focus on her own stuff. Thankfully though, when they reached a hallway that led to a few of the spare offices, Seal pointed to a door at the end and gave her a warm smile. The one she gave back was half-hearted, but Seal seemed to appreciate it all the same. However, she knew she couldn't go in and see Edward in such a state. It would only bring questions about why she was so affected, questions that she couldn't answer, so with a deep breath, she compartmentalized her thoughts and took a step towards the receptionist. She looked familiar, and Weiss immediately placed her as the person her father had fired almost a week ago. "Good afternoon, Miss Schnee," she said with a polite smile. "Mr. Caspin is expecting you." "Thank you," she said, but didn't move. She felt she owed an apology. At least there was one person she could give one to. "I'm sorry, by the way." The woman looked confused. "For getting you fired." "Oh, please not at all." The receptionist chuckled with a dismissive wave of her hand. "With all due respect, working for your father was very difficult. Mr. Caspin is a far better employer." "I see." Weiss hummed with a nod. "I guess things worked out for the best then." The woman only gave a nod in return before motioning towards the door. With a polite nod of her own, she turned away from the desk and knocked gently on the door. Barely a second passed before the shareholder replied. "It's open." She pushed her way in and gave the man a smile. Thankfully, she was used to forcing such a thing for business meetings. "Weiss, thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied and walked to shake the offered hand. "What can I help you with?" "We can get to that in a minute," he said kindly and sat down, as did Weiss. "But first, how have you been?" Weiss paused. There was something in the man's eyes that seemed familiar. A warmth that she had known as a child when visiting her grandfather, and it somehow dragged a half-truth from her. "In truth, not the best. What happened in Atlas is unsettling?" Weiss gave a nod. "Quite though, sadly, not unexpected. The White Fan has been giving us trouble for some time now, but this? Absolutely atrocious. I can't imagine how many memories this must bring up for you." "A few," Weiss admitted. "But I'm more upset about those poor people and families. Such a terrible thing. The Atlas branch is working closely with the military to find who did this though. I believe your sister has headed up the investigation. I don't suppose you would mind if I asked you a personal question, would you?" Weiss looked up into the man's eyes and saw that, despite the care in his voice, the question was important to him. She also saw that familiar glint again. It was easily recognizable to her as the same one her grandfather's eyes held, though that made sense since they were friends. "Ask away." "Thank you," he said with a smile. "You know your father better than I, mostly since I have tried to limit our interactions to business only, but in your honest opinion, do you think he did what the news has accused him of? Or if he is even capable of doing it?" Weiss gazed into the kind eyes for almost half a minute. She knew the answer, knew the truth, but she couldn't outright say it. But that didn't mean she had to defend Jacques' action either. "I can't say whether or not my father is guilty," Weiss sighed and shook her head. "Because I don't know. But I can say that I would not put it past him to do such a thing. That was my impression too, unfortunately." The man breathed and slumped a little in his chair. Unlike at the gala, Weiss could definitely see his age now. "I don't know what Nicholas was thinking when he left that man the company. It was one of the very few things we didn't see eye to eye on. Jacques can be quite conniving when he needs to be," Weiss replied with a sad sigh of her own. "Was this what you wanted to speak to me about? My father?" She held back a cringe as she said that word. "Huh? Oh, sort of." He sat back up and pulled a slip of paper from his desk. "General Ironwood and the other council members have summoned your father for a hearing due to these reports. They want to make sure that nothing illegal is going on." "I see. Well, I hope the news is wrong then, as that could be incredibly bad for the company." "I'm sure your father will work that all out," Edward said with a bitter tone, clearly not happy at leaving something to Jacques. "However, it does leave us with another issue. And that would be? Do you remember the discussion we had at the gala regarding the issue in Mistral?" Weiss recalled it with clarity and gave a small nod. "Good. Well, since your father will be in Atlas for some time, he He obviously can't visit the offices over there, and given this entire situation, we can hardly be seen putting such a heated situation on hold. So me and the other shareholders have discussed it, and we would like you to take your father's place." Weiss blinked slightly, taken aback by the request. She had of course been planning to hijack that particular situation ever since hearing about it, but had thought it would take a little more effort. She certainly hadn't expected it to fall into her lap like it just had. However, her silence clearly gave Edward the impression that she wasn't sure whether to accept. "You would be there for roughly a week, and it would mostly be boring meetings and working with the council, but the company has decided that meeting the minimum living wage during such hard times is the right thing to do. So you would be delivering good news to the people in Mistral at least." Weiss held herself off from accepting straight away. She could hardly come across as too eager. "While I'm more than happy to help in any way that I can, are you sure that I am the right person for the job?" "Of course," Caspin said with a smile. "Personally, I think your talents are wasted in accounting. Your work in the R&D department has more than shown what you are capable of, so when we were discussing who to send, your name was the first to come to mind. It wasn't hard to convince the others either." "Well then," Weiss put a flustered smile on her face, "I don't think it would be right for me to refuse." "Great," Edwards cheered. "Then I will have my assistant organize a proper meeting, and we will go over the finer details before you leave next week." "That sounds good to me." "To me too," the man said and stood up. She stood too. "But I should let you go. There is still plenty for me to do beforehand, and I'm sure you are plenty busy yourself." "That I am." Weiss held out her hand, and Edward quickly shook it. "And for what it's worth, Weiss," he said in a warm voice as their hands parted, "I know Nicholas is smiling down upon you right now. You really are a lot like him." Given recent events, she wasn't sure how true that was anymore, but she smiled anyway. "Thank you, Edward. I'm just glad he still has friends in the company." "That he does," the silver-haired man said proudly. "He may be gone, but he will always be remembered as the greatest friend I ever had." "Well, I'm sure he was lucky to have you as a friend too." "You're too kind." The man chuckled and sat back down. "But you really should be going. I wasn't lying about having a lot to do." "Of course." Weiss nodded and stepped away. "Until next time, Edward." The man gave a small wave, and Weiss walked back to the door. With a final glance back at the man who had already started on his work again, she left the room and handed the receptionist her new number to contact her on. The day had been a mixed bag. Definitely not as good as when she thought it would be that morning, but not as bad. A few good things had happened, and the opportunity to progress her plan had finally presented itself. The second part of her plan to take the company, also the final part needed to reveal her relationship with Young, was waiting for her in Mistral, and she hoped the months of work she had put into it would pay off. But there was also the bitter knowledge that the opportunity had only presented itself because of a plan that had already shown to have disastrous consequences. Thankfully, though, she could take a little comfort in the fact that the next part would definitely not have the same impact as her leaking stuff to the news. So with that in mind, she took a deep breath and pressed the button on the elevator. While she waited for it to arrive, she pulled her scroll from her pocket and typed in Yang's number. Maybe she would call her after all. Chapter 60. A box full of opportunity. Weiss couldn't believe her luck. For the first time since starting, her professor had canceled the class due to being out sick. Sure, that sucked for Professor Green, but it was the perfect excuse for her. With 2 hours left until her next class, there would be absolutely no point returning to the manor when she would have to leave again within 5 minutes. She also needed lunch, and as expensive as Beacon was, the food still left a lot to be desired. However, there was one place that was close to the college where she could get some amazing food, and she had been itching to go there for over a week. She had been looking for an excuse anyway, since she still needed to talk to Yang regarding the trip to Mistral that was quickly approaching. It was so close in fact that the ticket was already bought and in her bag. She still hated how the opportunity had come about, and still felt sick when she thought about the part she played, but it couldn't be for nothing. Her plan had to succeed, or she would never be able to face her reflection again. It was already hard enough. Even the talks with Yang had done little to dampen how horrible she felt about it, and waking from nightmares that had her handing the folder to the man who had made the scar on her face only made her feel worse. How did Jacques do it? She thought to herself as she left the college building and made her way to the gates, where she could already see reporters waiting for her. She couldn't work out how he was able to sleep at night after the collapses. How could he be okay with knowing his actions directly led to the deaths of innocent people? How did he sleep without nightmares? How did he not think about it all the time? Did he even think about it for any other reason than how the collapse affected the company? Miss Schnee, you look tired. How is this situation affecting you? Being the heiress to the world's largest company while attending college is quite a lot of work. Is it true that your father has a hearing with the Atlas Council? Yes. Weiss breathed tiredly. It was common knowledge, so she didn't really care about confirming it. General Ironwood and the other council members wished to hear his side of the story. And do you still believe he is innocent? I stand by my father. She echoed the same answer she gave whenever that question had been asked, even though it made her stomach turn. Even with these latest happenings? The attacks on the mine? Weiss stopped. Ahead of her was Hazel, roughly pushing aside reporters as he made his way to her, and though she knew she could make it to him easily, she didn't. Something had to be said. Something that wasn't a hollow speech by the CO. So as Hazel quickly made his way through the crowd, Weiss turned to look at the reporter who had asked the question. Thankfully, she recognized her as Lisa Lavender, a reporter for the very same news network she'd leaked the file to. Straightening her back, she took a deep breath and spoke into the microphones that were shoved into her face. The attack on the mine was orchestrated by a detestable branch of a once respectable organization. The loss of lives is a tragedy, and I sincerely hope the person responsible for releasing such lies knows exactly what they have caused, and while I cannot bring back the lives lost, the STC will be offering our full support with whatever the families of the deceased need. As she finished her speech, one she knew would come back to bite her since the STC has not yet made any official statement regarding supporting the families, she felt Hazel's strong hand grip her shoulder as the large man came to stand next to her. He stood with his back straight and proud, the sheer size of his muscular frame making all the reporters around her shrink back out of fear. Miss Schnee has answered enough of your questions, he said in a booming voice that carried across the car park. Thank you, Hazel. She smiled up at the man and turned back to walk towards the car. They had barely taken 5 steps when the reporters regained their confidence and began to ask her more questions. Fortunately, they were already close to the car, and it didn't take them long to slip inside. Where to? The apartment, please. As Hazel gave a nod, she thought on just how much trouble she would be in. The elder Schnee was definitely not going to like her speaking out of turn, and he would definitely find out that she had left the campus without returning to the manor, but at that moment, she couldn't care less. All she wanted was to talk to Yang, to not feel so miserable for just 5 minutes. So not caring just how much trouble she would be facing later, she fastened her seatbelt and sent a quick message to Yang. 5 minutes later, Weiss was stepping out of the car and walking towards Compass Tower, as were multiple reporters from multiple vans behind her. Shouts to gain her attention filled the air again as she walked through the door towards the desk, only for the door to be wrenched open a second later. People piled in, and Yatsu sat up straight. A small nod was sent her way, and she returned it with an appreciative smile as she walked past him. A small buzzer sounded the moment she passed, and the metal gate slid smoothly into place. Though it stopped the reporters from following her, it didn't stop the questions, so Weiss was happy that the elevator door blocked them out when she stepped inside. Less than a minute later, she stepped out into the familiar apartment and took a deep breath. It smelled like Yang, and that smell already felt more like home than the manor ever had. Before she could even let it out though, a streak of gold rushed forward and wrapped its arms around her in a tight hug. Though it was a little painful, Weiss didn't care and happily returned the embrace as she buried her face into the mess of golden hair. And there they stayed for at least 2 minutes, simply taking solace in the fact that they were finally together again. Gods, I missed you. Yang finally breathed though, the relief in her voice extremely apparent. How are you feeling? Weiss wanted to lie. Wanted to say that she was okay so that Yang's happiness at being together could continue a little longer, but she couldn't find it within her. Not when she was absolutely not okay. So with a slight sniffle, she slowly shook her head. I can't stop thinking about it, she muttered. All day, even when I sleep I just… SHH. I already told you, you're not responsible for this. But nothing. Yang cut her off firmly. We couldn't know this would happen. You can't blame yourself for the White Fawn's bullshit. They're fear-mongers, Weiss. They try to make people afraid, try to make them feel persecuted to convince them to join up. This is just another one of their stupid attempts to recruit people. I know, Weiss admitted. I still gave them a reason, though. Yang finally pulled away, and lilac eyes gazed lovingly into her. Warmth and comfort immediately rushed through her, and she couldn't even find the will to blink the tear away. Thankfully, Yang took it upon herself to wipe it away anyway with a soft smile. They would have found another reason anyway. Just look at what they wrote on the entrance. 9 of ours, 9 of yours. They didn't even acknowledge that 5 humans died in the collapse. That's what they do, Weiss. They twist things until you feel sympathy for them, until you think they are right to do what they do or that you are somehow to blame. It's exactly what Adam used to do. So please stop blaming yourself for this, okay? For the first time, Weiss lied to Yang and gave a small nod. Though what Weiss had said made sense, it still didn't change that she had still provided the documents that caused them to act. Yes, they would have found something else, but it would have been less concrete than what she had given. However, it was easy to see that Yang didn't believe her. You look tired. Like I said, Weiss sniffled and leaned back in to rest her head on the boxer's chest. I haven't been sleeping. How long until your next class? About 2 hours. Her words were muffled by Yang's jacket. Why? Because you need a nap. Your eyes are bloodshot. I'll just have a nightmare again, she mumbled. Please. There was something in the tone of her girlfriend's tone that told her the blonde was smiling. When have I not scared them away? Weiss couldn't help but chuckle. As miserable as she was, even she couldn't deny how much better she slept with Yang at her side. She always woke up feeling better, more refreshed, and happy, though the latter was mostly because the blonde was at her side. But a nap really did sound good, since she really was tired. You promise? Always. Weiss paused, but she really didn't need much convincing. After a nod, she felt Yang pull back and guide her towards the bedroom. She trusted Yang to keep her safe, that by sleeping next to her the woman would somehow push away the bad dreams, so she obediently followed. It didn't take long for them to reach the master bedroom, and for her shoes to be stripped away, but Weiss was already starting to feel her eyes close. So when they finally climbed into the bed and cuddled up together, it didn't take long for the familiar scent to fill her senses and lull her to sleep. Here you go. The plate of food that was pushed under her nose from behind smelled amazing, and made her mouth water as she reached out to take it. The moment Yang's hands were free, they wrapped around her, and a kiss was placed against her cheek. Though she could make out the shrimp, there were a couple of things she hadn't tried before. What is it? She asked curiously, not really needing an answer when everything Yang cooked tasted amazing. Just some barbecue shrimp and couscous. Some herbs and cheese and stuff. You put cheese on everything. That's because cheese is great on everything. Weiss let out a soft chuckle and took a bite of the food. Just as it always did, flavor exploded in her mouth, and she let out a satisfied hum that earned her another kiss on the cheek. See, a little sleep and some good food and you're happier already. Only because you're here, Weiss said contentedly and reached up to take one of her girlfriend's hands. It was true. With Yang by her side, the nightmares hadn't invaded her sleep for the first time since she'd heard the news. She wasn't sure how the blonde did it, whether it was the scent that Weiss found so relaxing, or the distinctive warmth that seemed to radiate from the woman's body. Maybe it was just the knowledge that she was finally back in the company of the girl she loved, or a combination of all those things. But something about Yang being next to her always helped Weiss sleep better. Yeah, well, good thing I ain't going anywhere, Yang replied and used one hand to vault over the couch, her plate balanced perfectly on her other, and not spilling a single crumb. Unlike you. The woman stuck her tongue out to show she was joking. You leave on Tuesday, right? MHM. Weiss swallowed her food as Yang started hers. I should only be a week, maybe a little more. I have some other business to take care of in August too, so I may take a little detour before I come back. Oh. I think I want to visit Fletch. You think he's ready to sell? I'm honestly not sure, but it feels like I've hit the limit of what I can do with emails. Now I need to talk to him face to face. Besides, I'm not sure I want to buy it anymore. Yang's eyes opened wide as she sat back and crossed her legs. Weiss wasn't surprised at the reaction though, since her change of mind had only happened just after leaking the documents to the press. With how her father acted, it became quite easy to see how her plan could backfire. "Huh?" Yang asked and took another bite of her food. "But you've been trying to get that patent for months now. Why do you need to talk to him if you don't want it anymore?" "I still want the patent, just not for the STC." Weiss took another bite of her food and placed the half-empty plate on the table in front of her as Yang's brow furrowed deeper. Swallowing the delicious shrimp, she turned to look at her girlfriend. "The thing is, if I get it on behalf of the company, which I honestly don't think I can do at the moment, then Jock owns it. That means I can't use it for leverage, and my chances of keeping my position drop significantly. So instead of buying the patent from Fletch, I was thinking that I can convince him to start a business with me." "You want to go into business with him?" "Well, it would be more accurate to say it would simply be an equity investment in Fletch restarting his own company, which he has mentioned wanting to do a few times now, which means I would be a partner. That would also mean I have access to the patent if he transfers it over to the company to work on it." "And how will that help you with your company?" Yang asked curiously as she continued to eat her food. "Because since I'll have access to a patent that I know the STC wants, I can discuss a partnership between us and the STC. Temporary, with us keeping all rights to the patent, but then when the company transfers over to me, I can either make mine and Fletch's company part of the STC or just stay partnered. Either way, I maintain access to the patent and am able to use it." Yang simply stared at her for a minute and slowly at her food. Thoughts rushed past her lovely lilac eyes as she processed everything that had just been said, and Weiss reached out for her own plate of food. For a minute more, silence filled the room as they both ate, but Yang finally broke it with a small breath. "That's quite devious of you, but isn't it unfair to Fletch?" she asked cautiously. "I mean, buying the patent is one thing because it would be his choice to part with it, but using his dream of starting his company again so that we can come out easier? I still hate that we essentially did that to Ilya with her worst memories, but to do it again just feels weird." Weiss appreciated that Yang was being honest. It was part of what she loved about the woman. She too hated that they'd hurt Ilya, and then so many more families, but Fletch was a different case. "Fletch is a businessman, Yang," she said reassuringly. "He'll already be aware that my offer will come with an ulterior motive. Plus, I intend to be completely open with him about my intentions, so then it will be his choice anyway. He still has all the power here, since I'm the one who needs his patent, and he will maintain control of the company, so even then it will be him who gets the final say. My input on how it operates will just have to be acknowledged is all." "Are you sure?" Yang asked, her voice making it clear that she wanted to believe her. Thankfully, Weiss had no reason to lie, and gave a slight nod. "Yes. I don't want to do business how the STC has been for the past 20 years. I want to do it how my grandfather did it, by earning the respect of those I do business with. I'm not about to start lying and tricking people to get ahead." Yang took another bit of the food as she thought through things again, and Weiss respectfully waited while eating her own. She really wanted Yang to be okay with her plan, since there was really nothing else she could do. There was no other leverage she could gain, and simply having Ironwood on her side was not enough. Not that she even knew if she did still have Ironwood on her side after leaking the documents that caused an attack on the city. "Okay then, so long as he knows everything." "He will," Weiss replied with a smile and leaned back onto the couch. "I promise." "Good." Yang smiled and turned in her seat to move in closer. With a smile to herself, Weiss pulled the control towards herself and turned on the television. It wasn't long before she found the comedy channel they usually put on, and she relaxed into her girlfriend to eat her fantastic food. The show was another rerun from how grainy the picture was, but Yang clearly liked it, though it was hard not to see why when a pun had been said roughly 30 seconds after the opening credits. However, while Yang thought the talk was over, Weiss still had something she wanted to discuss with the boxer. She wasn't sure how Yang would respond, since the girl had a lot going on, but she was really hoping that the response would be a good one. So when the program finally went to a break and they both finished their food, she leaned in and gave the blonde a small kiss, followed by a smile. "Would you mind getting my bag?" Yang hummed with a grin. "Gonna cost ya." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't help laughing as she pressed in for a proper kiss. She lingered for a good couple of seconds, enjoying the warmth of her girlfriend's lips and the taste of the barbecue shrimp, but finally pulled away with a soft hum and a cheeky smile. Why do I keep paying? Because you love it as much as I do. Yang laughed and took the plates from the table as she stood up. Gonna soak these real quick. Pause it if it comes back on. Weiss couldn't help but look back as her girlfriend jogged away in her shorts. As bad as she had been feeling when she arrived, the blonde had definitely helped her feel better. But that wasn't especially unusual. So while she waited, she thought through how she wanted to ask. She didn't want to sound needy or inconsiderate to everything Yang had going on, but it was also something she really wanted, since the last week had been almost unbearable. Unfortunately, it only took Yang a minute before she was back at the couch, an arm wrapping around her shoulder as her bag and a bottle of water being dropped into her lap. Yes, made it, the girl breathed. You can stick around till the end, right? MHM. Weiss hummed and leaned back in. I got about 15 minutes. Good. A kiss was placed against her cheek before Yang returned her attention to the television due to the program starting back up. With the wonderful woman distracted, Weiss slowly pulled a box from her bag and hid it next to her leg. She was still a little unsure how to ask, but knew she shouldn't overthink it. There were a few ways she could ask, but they all felt too formal, too weird, so a couple of minutes later, she settled on the most simple of them. Hey, Yang? Weiss asked cautiously and picked up the box to turn it over in her hands. I have something for you. Huh? Yang's head turned away from the television and looked down at the box. But first, Weiss cut her off before she could say anything. I just want you to know you can say no. I know you have a lot going on, and this isn't the right time, so if you can't, then just say so. Okay? Yang grinned and reached out to take the rectangular box. Now you have me curious. She reached out to take the box, but Weiss pulled it back and raised an eyebrow. Okay, I will say no if I have to. Now give me my present, she said and stuck out her tongue. Weiss rolled her eyes and finally let Yang take the box from her. Without hesitation, she pulled the lid off to reveal what was inside. A first-class plane ticket sat at the bottom. The same ticket from Vale to Mistral that had been sat in her bag for the last 2 days. Very carefully, Yang pulled the paper free of the container and looked at it with confusion. Well, I'm glad it's not jewelry. What's this? Her tone was unreadable and made Weiss a little nervous. Not seeing you this week has been frustrating to say the least, and it keeps getting more and more frustrating that we have to spend so much time apart. And I really don't want to spend another week without seeing you. And I know it's really not the best time for you with everything that's happening with your dad and Raven, but I was hoping that you would maybe come with me. Yang slowly turned to look at her. Her face was impassive for a moment, but it didn't take long for a wide smile to etch itself onto her lips. Taking that as a good sign, Weiss continued. I would be working a lot, but I would also have some free time. Yes. WH what? She had expected a no. Yes. But everything here? Your dad? Raven? College? All I've done for a month now is think about Dad, Yang admitted. But right now, I need to think about the fact we might have to go to therapy, which I have never been good at, and a vacation will help relax me for that at least. I want a week with you to take my mind off everything, and I want to be there for you since you clearly don't want to be alone. Raven won't mind at all, and I can take time off from college whenever. Weiss was a little taken aback by how eager Yang was, but who is she to argue? Yang was right that she didn't want to be alone when she could have a vacation with a woman she loved. Are you sure? She asked, wanting to make sure Yang really had thought about it. A week with you? Absolutely. Really? For God's sake, Weiss. Yang leaned in and pressed a firm kiss against her lips. They lingered there for a couple of seconds before pulling away. Lilac eyes locked firmly onto hers. Yes. I told you I would say no if I couldn't go. Oh, okay. Weiss smiled and kissed her girlfriend again. There is something else I was going to say too. Isn't there always? Yang replied teasingly. What else? Well, Weiss paused and took Yang's hand. Whether I get him to agree or not, Fletch is the last thing I need to do. So when we get back, I want to tell people about us. Yang stared at her. It had already been talked about that they would be telling Jacques rather soon, that it was almost time to take that step, so she knew Yang wasn't worried about that, but there was definitely some concern on her girlfriend's face. "But what if you don't get it?" she asked softly. "Do you have enough to stay where you are? We don't have to rush this, Weiss." "I know." Weiss smiled at her girlfriend, loving the fact she was willing to wait even longer if plans didn't go how she wanted them to. "But I don't want to wait anymore. I just said that I hate being apart from you, and so long as I'm fighting for the company and keeping us a secret, I'll have to be." Weiss stared into the pair of lilac eyes, trying her best to make Yang see that she was certain of it. All week, Weiss knew that she could have seen Yang if they were out to the public. She may not have been able to visit the apartment, but they could have met in public on breaks. She could have even visited her at Beacon or the office. The fact that even those were not possible still bugged her, and with everything that was going on, she didn't want those limitations to continue any longer. And the only way they could do that was to finally face the man stopping them, and face whatever he threw at them. With or without Fletch agreeing to her offer, they would be out in less than 2 weeks. Thankfully, Yang seemed to see how serious she was, and her face broke into a small grin. "I guess we are finally doing this then. Only 6 months too late," Weiss chuckled. "And I wouldn't change those 6 months for all the money in the world." Yang grinned. Feeling happiness well within her, Weiss pulled Yang in and placed a loving kiss on her girlfriend. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until they were out. 2 weeks until the whole world could see how happy she was. 2 weeks until she started going against her father properly. And though it would be much longer than 2 weeks until he was gone from her life, she knew his time was quickly running out. So as she let her hand slip into the wild mane of blonde hair, a smile pulled at her face. When they finally pulled apart, Weiss cuddled back up as they both turned back to the television. She only had a couple more minutes until she had to leave, until she had to get back to stressful college and STC work, and she intended to make full use of that time with her girlfriend.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.